Good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Sainato with Real Progressives. This evening we have a special guest. Mal Hyman is running for Congress in South Carolina's 7th Congressional District against Republican Incumbent Representative Tom Rice. Mr. Hyman, thank you for joining us this evening. Could you start off by telling myself and our viewers a little bit about your background and what inspired you to run for Congress?
Sure. I grew up in Los Angeles, started UCLA in 1968, so I guess it figured that I'd be involved somehow, some way in cultural and political change. Started walking precincts for Robert Kennedy and played basketball with guys whose brothers were in gangs, other fellas whose parents had been through the Holocaust. I could see the air I was breathing, and they were going to draft me to fight in Vietnam, and it got my attention. So I've been a progressive Democrat, different stripes my life, and worked full-time for George McGovern. Took a year off in '73 to go to the Middle East. I lived on a kibbutz, came back and decided I'd try teaching. And I've been a teacher for 42 years in the public schools, in the prisons. Taught 5 years in a medium security prison, Chino Prison. Did graduate school at UC Riverside in international relations. Had the good fortune of getting a job teaching sociology and political science at a small college in South Carolina 30 years ago. So I've been involved in the political process my whole adult life. What I see now is alarming and appalling. I ran last time for Congress with the feeling that I could give a progressive agenda in terms that conservatives and independents could understand. And I was very encouraged, but it is difficult to run on a couple $100,000. Learned a lot, so I'm still in the fight, a little tougher and wiser. I have had an interest in environmental issues my whole life. My first environmental arrest was Diablo Canyon, the building of a nuclear plant on an active earthquake fault line. Got arrested protesting Pentagon spending. When I ran a campaign for a popular professor running for Congress in 1984, Mel Gurtov, it was in Southern California. Gurtov was part of the Pentagon Papers, so our first fundraiser was Dan Ellsberg and Tony Russo were there. So I've been at this a long time and figure that maybe this is the time to build a wider movement and people will vote for some change.
And you've noted that you've had some experience in California, but what can you tell us about, obviously, the political differences in South Carolina? And obviously, I'm sure a lot of people around the country have some stereotypes about how conservative South Carolina is. The Democratic Party treats places like South Carolina and other Republican strongholds. They tend to write them off. So what have you found works in engaging voters in places like South Carolina where Republicans hold the majority of the power?
That's a great question. The short answer is, I think when I came from California, I was filled with a lot of stereotypes based on the media about folks in South Carolina, and they are filled with many stereotypes about people who live in California. You have a stronger church community, a little stronger evangelical community. The black ministers don't tend to meet with the white ministers in most of the cities in this state. But again, it's based on region. A very weak AFL-CIO. It's only about 2% of the workers here. Weak Democratic Party. The lack of a 50-state strategy has been an ongoing problem. State Democratic Party is essentially broke. Lists are not good. They haven't done the voter registration. They haven't done the canvassing. So we're having to recreate the party, but it also creates opportunities for the most progressive wing of the party to speak clearly about issues of justice and folks are listening here. They just haven't heard the message much. In this state, we're pulling the bottom third of our college class into teaching. Most ministers do not have a prophetic message. They tend to be very cautious and quiet. So that, for example, with 45% of the African American kids living below the poverty level, below the age of 6, we have not heard from the black ministers what they need to do to create opportunity. They're not leading coalitions. So, as somebody running for office, it gives me the chance to start to run by organizing. And I've tried to do that. So I find in South Carolina, there's a lot more opportunity than one might think, because the Democrats have turned into social clubs at many of the county party meetings and are not accustomed to actually fighting to win in a political campaign. All that, I think, is changing, but that is kind of the lay of the land here. I could meander. There just is not. There are not many progressive voices, but when people hear a progressive agenda, as long as it can be in plain English, doesn't seem ideological, is inclusive and embraces moderates, they're listening.
And can you speak to some of the issues that your campaign is focusing on?
We have talked to every audience about the need for health care as a human right, and I will frame it in the way that I've framed it to Rotary clubs so that they can understand that this is good for business as well as good for the dignity of people. And I let folks know that a Medicare for all based on a Canadian system is supported by conservative Canadian businessmen because it costs them a lot less money and it lowers the national debt. And they live 3 years longer and everybody's covered, and it's run by the provinces. Here it could be run by the states. And it is so popular that the Conservative Party in Canada strongly supports it. I haven't said anything different than what Bernie Sanders is saying, other than I've couched it in a little different framework. And I think that's a framework that might resonate a little bit better. In class, you get to try things out. There, in some ways, a focus group. And those country club kids in the back of the room listened when I talked about it being good for business as well as good for families. Here, education is a great problem. There's unequal spending for schools. What I concentrate on is creating equal opportunities so kids come into school ready to succeed. We're only funding about half the kids that are eligible for Head Start. The programs we have for childhood health are difficult to access in this state. There's a role for a federal government in getting kids ready for school. It takes a village to raise a child, but in a global economy, oftentimes you need a state and a national government to help the village. People are listening on questions of climate change as well. And I try to make this in terms of stewardship and in terms of global citizenship. And I remind them what the Pentagon report said on climate change being a threat to national security, that climate change was a greater threat to our national security than terrorism. And people are listening to that. Taxes are front and center. It's easy to clarify that this tax proposal is good for the wealthy, bad for the working class, could be done differently. I take my time and I share with them that corporate profits, when studied by Harvard in their business review 2014, 90% of the profits the corporations get, stock market going through the roof, they're doing stock buybacks and boosting the price of the stock. They're having extra dividends to their shareholders, and they're doing mergers and acquisitions. That's 90% of what they're doing with their profits. Last thing they need is a drop in corporate taxes without a closing of loopholes. And we know how to invigorate the economy, and people are listening. They realize a tax break to the working class, a tax break to small businesses is going to give more dividends to the whole economy, increase aggregate demand. And that's the shot in the arm we need, and people are listening to it. So I'd say those are the issues that are coming up the most.
And what can you tell us about your Republican opponent, Tom Rice, who's been in office since, I believe, 2013 when he first took office? What are some of your criticisms of his your representation of your district?
Well, he's not publicly criticized Trump on anything. He votes with the Republican Party 98% of the time. He's a millionaire tax attorney who worked his way onto the Ways and Means Committee, and you can see a pattern of tax breaks and loopholes for those who put money into his campaigns. He gets about 60% of his money from PACs. So he's a Tea Party Republican who is leading the charge for repeal and replacing Obamacare, and leading the charge for the new Republican tax reform proposals.
And I know some of your district is in on the coast of South Carolina. You mentioned climate change. A couple of years ago, South Carolina had some really bad flooding. So did that flooding impact your district at all? And what have you done to try to really connect with voters the urgency that climate change is real, that South Carolina needs to start taking measures to mitigate the effects of climate change, as well as other environmental risks from pollution to various industries that tend to have a lot of negative consequences on the environment?
We did see flooding in this district, and in running for office, at times it's a listening tour. You're talking to people, the endurance that they had during the floods and their hopes that the federal government can come through and help them. Talked with mayors about flooding in coastal areas, and most of your viewers probably have seen an inconvenient sequel than the flooding in Miami, and we've seen that in Georgetown, a city south of Myrtle Beach, where about 4 times a year there's flooding. It's not front center as an issue, but people are listening on that issue. They realize we could be building more windmills and solar panels here in the United States rather than buying them from Europe and from Asia. So it's an issue that's starting to resonate. But really, nationally, we don't require a class on ecology in most colleges, and most teachers are not trained in environmental science or ecology. So it doesn't come up nearly as much as it needs to, as clearly our civilization is a force of nature that threatens our security, and we're making decisions for hundreds of generations. It's an awesome responsibility that we're not conceptualizing. It was part of the reason I decided to run against Rice when I had him and his opponent, Gloria Tanubu, to the campus at Coker College. Rice couldn't answer the questions on climate change, and he hemmed and hawed. And I told him about the Pentagon report, the UN reports, and he said he'd look into it, and really has never spoken out on it, and has not done anything to try to bring about increased government investment in sustainable energy. I am running an ongoing Earth Day in Hartsville. This will be my 9th year doing it. I have a panel discussion on sustainable energy that I've done. This is my 5th year working on that. Most folks don't know that we actually have a research center for sustainable energy in North Charleston, not my district, but in the state. and were building windmills in South Carolina, and was able to speak yesterday some to the state legislature on the need for more expenditures for sustainable energy when they had their hearings on offshore oil drilling. When I should mention, that's one of the issues in this district, the offshore oil drilling that had been pushed into a moratorium by President Obama. That moratorium was overturned by President Trump, and there's a great fear there'll be more drilling offshore. Initially, they want to have testing, and that was the nature of the hearings yesterday before the State House. So as an issue, it's near and dear, not as much, I'd say, statewide. So you're able to use the campaign to raise consciousness some on the issue and to invigorate debate some.
Now, most if not everyone watching are big Bernie supporters. And in the 2016 presidential campaign, he didn't do too well in South Carolina. So if he decides to run in 2020, what would be your advice for him or other progressive presidential candidates to improve their performances in South Carolina? And what do you think is his campaign was missing that I think he got just a little over 30% of the vote?
Yeah, I worked with Sanders on the campaign and hired one of his field directors to run my campaign. Sanders hadn't spent enough time here. When he did spend the time, he was exceedingly effective. I was at a gathering fairly late in the campaign with a number of African-American ministers and activists in Florence. Sanders carried the day. His answers were terrific, heartfelt, clear, experienced. He didn't have enough people on the ground. He started later than Clinton did. He didn't put money into the black churches. There are a number of political strategies that are specific to rural southern states, and he was mastering them. And also at the very end of the campaign, where he could have doubled down and spent more time here, albeit losing, he would have lost closer. He had all the challenges of a national campaign and chose to campaign in other states. So had he spent, let's say, the 4 or 5 additional days here, he would have done better. He was catching on. And I think his message is resonating now. He deserves great credit with a prophetic message. And incidentally, it's the first time in the 30 years I've been in South Carolina that somebody has raised the banner of a progressive message, and it did resonate. I just don't think he had the money, the staff, or he spent the time here to have it flourish the way it could have.
In terms of your own campaign, I read somewhere, I don't know if it was accurate, that you ran as a Democrat, but you had support from the Working Families Party and the Green Party. So can you tell us a little bit about other organizations or other parties that you're working with to help you through this campaign? And why are those types of coalitions, do you feel, are important in politics?
I was pleased to be keynote speaker at the AFL-CIO annual conference. And they, of course, are the impetus behind the Working Families Party. I've always been a supporter of the Greens and their environmental commitment and their commitment to get money out of politics. They are not very strong in the state. They allow you to run fusions, so I did that. I think the art of reform is the art of coalition. I'm working with the Our Revolution group, the Indivisible group, the Action Together groups. I think in the wake of the campaign, you build a progressive movement as effectively as you can. You organize to run and run to organize. I think all of that is true, and it gives you a chance to bring people together to do some networking. I'm using a strategy that Ralph Nader has used before, in that I'm doing some community organizing along with the campaigning. We're going to do a series of panel discussions on drug addiction and opioid use, bringing in recovering addicts, the treatment community, the law enforcement community, ministers, and I'll be able to speak on the need for a change in drug policy, although I'll just give a short speech, and we're going to do a dozen of those in the district to both introduce the candidacy, but also create a setting for other progressives to be able to join in, and for these different elements of the progressive community to start to know each other and feel trust and start to work together.
And what other advice would you give to other people who are, weighing whether they should run for whether it's Congress or another political office in places where the Democratic Party really hasn't had the infrastructure or the resources to, depend on to push a campaign forward?
I think this is a time when people want significant change. This is our hour, and I also think there's a crisis in the country. It's time to be the change we wish to see. So all of this is risk. It's not easy to do it at first, but it's also not that tough. And you learn by doing, just as you would in any organizing or teaching, so that as you get out there, you have a better sense of it. I would talk to other political leaders to see what they have to say, to get advice. Sooner I was able to plug into other candidates that were running. There are similar stories to tell, what you do on Facebook, Twitter, how you deal with television and radio. There's a number of things that you can learn along the way. There aren't many people who have run as a progressive that aren't taking corporate or banking money, so it makes it a little bit tougher to run, but it can be done because social media has given us a much more level playing field. So I say now is a particularly important time to run. A progressive message will resonate. I think it's a matter of courage and conviction. I've sat down with a number of beginning candidates to encourage them, and I tell them what I experienced last time, what I'm experiencing this time. And I think the closeness of the election in South Carolina in a previously red district, Mulvaney's district, where Archie Parnell challenged the last time, went from a 60-40 Republican win to a 52-48 Republican win. And that was a few months ago. And I think that's indicative of relatively rural South Carolina on a modest amount of money. I think we're looking at a wave election like after Watergate, and it's time for us to seize the day, finally push back, and make the changes that are possible. I know it's daunting at first, but I would submit this process can be cleansing, and it's a chance to organize as well as run for office.
And is there anything else you would like people to know about your campaign or what's been going on in your district before I let you go?
You know, it's so difficult to speak in sound bites, but I've been sharing. I'd like to be the first member of Congress that's actually taught in a medium security prison, so I can talk about prison reform. And I start with a story typically about what inmates would tell me, and this is back from 77 to 82, but the stories are similar. And I'd ask them, at what point did you lose your hope? And they typically say at the age of 11, 12, and 13. And then even to conservative audiences, I could say they made some bad choices, but they didn't pick their parents. They didn't pick their communities. They didn't pick their schools and they didn't pick their country. We've made some bad choices. And either we're going to truly leave no child behind, or we're just going to talk about it. Either we're going to have liberty and justice for all, or we just talk about it. Either we're going to do unto the least of these, or we're just going to talk about it. All children have a right to health care, food, housing, good schools, safe streets, clean air, clean water. Marion Wright Edelman, who inspired Martin Luther King's Poor People's March on Washington in 1968, has been fighting for this for 50 years. It needs to be front and center if we want to turn this country around. Now's the time. People are listening. And when I tell them that, I'm also able to say what Martin Luther King said to the sanitation workers 1968 in Memphis, where he said it is a crime in this wealthy nation for people to work for starvation wages. And if you calculate the cost of living, minimum wage now is lower than it was back in 1968. I think we can connect with the working class and with the business class with a progressive message, say what needs to be said. And I tell them I'm not taking a dime of corporate or banking money, because you can't serve two masters. And I believe it, and I'll fight on that. And if somebody like me breaks through and wins without taking their money, I can stand up on the floor of Congress and talk about what's going on and be free and independent from the money, so I can say what I think the people want to say.
Well, Mr. Hyman, thank you again for joining us this evening. For those of you watching, in the comments section, I will post his campaign website and his Twitter and Facebook account, so you can follow those to see how his campaign's going, and find out more about him through those sites, or send him donations, or let people in South Carolina know that we have a progressive running in the 7th district. So, Mr. Hyman, thank you again for joining us, and it was a pleasure meeting you and speaking with you.
It was a pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you. Good night, everyone.